Hello and welcome to week 6 of Philosophy 1024, Searching for Reality. And this week we're going to look at Rene Descartes. He will be the last half of the set of modules. First we're going to kind of move into a historical period, the Renaissance, or the Renaissance. Actually, Renaissance is a French word, right? It means rebirth. And it is the rebirth of what? It's the rebirth of human beings. And I would argue that it's in fact the birth of human beings. We haven't heard of us up until now. So keep that in mind as we look to see what distinguishes the Renaissance and the Baroque period in particular from everything else we've looked at so far, because it is important. It literally is the introduction of the human subject into philosophy and into thought for essentially the first time. So we want to break it down to Renaissance humanism, right? The key word human, or about humanity. And we'll compare that with Baroque pessimism. Baroque pessimism is sort of an increased awareness or self-consciousness about individuals. And that also factors into some of the responses by philosophers to this alleged Baroque pessimism, or a reality, right? A reality of who we are. And the fact that we wear out and die, right? So how are we going to live our lives? If you're facing death every day, you do the best you could, right? Makes sense. And these are the kinds of ideas that we're going to see sort of at work in the Baroque period. And then, like I say, we'll end up with Descartes. So let's look first of all at the idea of the Renaissance and when it happens, why it happens at that particular point, because history is always a continuation of certain ideas, even by way of opposition. And here we have a kind of opposition to what we were looking at last week, which is really during the early Middle Ages. We have the power of the church in controlling society and cultural developments. And the Renaissance, I keep calling that, or Renaissance, we'll say, the English way of saying it. The Renaissance is really that period that starts around the 14th century, so about the 1300s, in Italy, and it moves out from Florence literally across Europe, right? Not from Rome. Remember, Rome was the central power. It's done. It's gone, right? It's slowly on its way back. So we shift from a political center to a cultural center. Very important. So that cultural center of Florence, its ideas begin to radiate out across Western Europe. And it spreads across Europe till about the 17th century, so about the 1600s. So you're looking at about a 300-year period, which is the tail end of the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, the Dark Ages as well, whatever you want to call it. Not a good time to be alive, because the individual essentially almost doesn't exist. It's not discussed, right? It's not important. Society is not even in existence. The idea certainly isn't. So we have serfs, and we have peasants, and we have lords, and we have manors, and we have kings and bishops. That's really it, right? Those are categories. Those aren't even people, right? They're just ideas about people. This is about to change. This is about to change here. And the focus is on this humanist aspect. And so we have this humanist focus on classical scholarship. And here again, you can see the study of poetry, right? The study of a language, what people say, the way they speak, the way they express their thoughts, grammar, right? A real focus now on grammar, how to say something correctly using the proper rhetorical figures. And of course, poetry and grammar work really well together. But again, look at them as expressions of human beings, expressions of humanity. We also have a renewed focus on history. And this is something important because this is perhaps the first time in history, right, quote unquote, where individuals are actually aware of their historical position, because self-consciousness is something that becomes a very important aspect during both the Renaissance and the Baroque period. This self-awareness that things are different. Things look different. They sound different. People act differently. So that self-awareness that those individuals are in a new historical epoch, we'll say, is very important. And in fact, influences their thinking as well. And we can see, of course, along with poetry and grammar, the study of rhetoric. Again, a study on speaking correctly, speaking well, right? Not just speaking good, right? But speaking well. And this is, again, an attempt by human beings to express their highest aspirations, express the highest versions of themselves. And as an example, in 1486, we have the Oration on the Dignity of Man. The title says it all, right? An oration, so a rhetorical exposition, right? A summary on what makes human beings good. And just the idea of us even having dignity should be mind-blowing. And it is, because suddenly individuals consider themselves of having some modicum of dignity and some desire to be treated with some form of self-respect. And so we have individuals now, serfs and peasants, typically covered in mud, toiling in the fields. They're just cogs in a wheel, right? And one day, people desire to achieve something better. They wish to tap into that human potential. They wish to express some sort of human dignity. And above all, and what informs it, is something called human rationality. So the Renaissance is this term that is kind of a label that's attached by later historians. Now we say later historians. I've just finished saying that the individuals living at this time are quite self-aware of what's going on. It takes a period of time before historians can actually give it a name. And there is this notion of a rebirth, right? And I say the rebirth of what? Essentially, it is the birth of human beings, right? Of humanity, of individuals who have potential, who have dignity, who have self-worth. So those things are really part of what makes the Renaissance humanistic. So we have these sort of two main ideas. The first one is this concern with the arts and culture, but arts and culture of antiquity, right? We're talking about in Rome, the Latin antiquity, then we have the Greek antiquity that we've been discussing, Greek philosophy, architecture, art. And this is kind of a return to something prior to theology, right? So now we're kind of overstepping almost 1,000 years because we're around the 1300s at this point, and the desire to look past what we have just lived through, which is roughly 1,000 years of what's known as the Dark Ages, and the control of the church over cultural and social affairs, certainly cultural and political affairs for sure, but a return back to antiquity and a kind of a reassessment of what made antiquity so wonderful. Now remember, this is being done through, in a sense, rose-tinted glasses, because the one thing that was forgotten at this point is that those writing in Greek and Roman times, since they're in charge, they're not going to write down all the awful things they did. They're going to present themselves in the best possible light. That's what winners do. Those who win historically write the best versions of themselves. So 1,000 years later, we have this sort of rediscovery, or again, discovery of the human aspect, right? The human condition. And we see for the first time discussions about human beings really in this time period, right? So this is the beginning of the previous millennia, like leading up to the time of Christ and shortly after. So we have this concern with the arts and culture of antiquity rather than this sort of medieval concern with theology, which we had discussed just last week. And then secondly is this form of humanism that is slowly developing over, again, this is over 300 years, slowly developing over a sort of renewed focus on man, human beings, and most important, the creative and intellectual abilities that we have as human beings. There is a tremendous flowering in writing, in cultural activities, in art, and in music at this particular time. The field of classical music, for example, is believed to really start in earnest around this point in time. And these are the pieces of music that are still being played today. So the degree of excellence was already there. Now, the most important thing, again, this is a return back to the ancient world, in particular ancient Athens, because we've talked about antiquity, In ancient Athens, there was something called paideia, right, which is lifelong education. And those writers and philosophers and thinkers of the Renaissance really felt strongly about this notion of pedagogy, right? Pedagogy is basically just education. So that kind of humanism that we see during the Renaissance, this flowering of cultural and intellectual and artistic activities, is also pedagogical, right? There is this idea that education and learning is the key to human progress. And this is again a key that we've seen, that we see philosophers return to time and again. We have the Enlightenment in the 1700s. When we look in a few weeks at utilitarianism and utility, even the French Enlightenment thinkers, as radical as some of them may have been, were all saying the same thing, that education was the key to human progress. Ignorance was not bliss. Ignorance was fatal. Ignorance was what kept people down. So if we could educate individuals, we could then find that key to progress together, right? Socially, culturally, historically, politically, and so on, and move forward and find better versions of ourselves. Now, as these kinds of thoughts are going on, we also have remarkably very important scientific discoveries. And these are discoveries that are essentially going to change everything, absolutely everything. So think about these and let these sink in when you consider Gardner, right, in the textbook, talks about 3 inventions in particular. Think about the compass. A compass. First, for the first time, individuals can actually understand where they're going. They used to navigate using the stars, did a very good job of it, but the compass now can indicate no matter what the weather is, no matter how dark it is, in the middle of the night, an individual can now know as they're traveling in a boat, or even walking, but certainly traveling, they can know where they are, right? They know where north, south, east, and west is. So now you can start to move beyond the confines of your immediate surroundings and move forward out into the world and explore it. So that's the first thing. Now, unfortunately, along with that exploration, we have firearms. So put those two together. We have a compass that tells us what direction we're going, where we're headed. We invent firearms so that, guess what? Once we get to where we're going, we can take it over because we've got the guns and they don't. And on top of those two, very, in terms of certainly culture, imperialism, colonialism, but political movement outwards, right? Conquest, really, that's what I'm talking about. Political conquest. The compass and the invention of firearms are probably 2 of the most important inventions to help to perpetuate this, right? Still human beings, but now we can harness science to our own ends. And these ends are, of course, political. The third one, and this is the one that is probably the most important because it has the most impact right across the board, and that is the printing press around 1440, the Gutenberg Press, which you've heard of. And so when you think about that, the printing press now allows for mass production and distribution of ideas. So in the same way, and again, this is a kind of not a perfect metaphor or example, but consider it, in the same way that the ancient Athenians discarded mythology as an ancient way of thinking about the world, around the same time is this new Greek alphabet. So this new Greek alphabet allows individuals to write their ideas down, not in some sort of poetic form with stanzas and rhyming couplets and so on, but just to write, simply write in the best way they could the ideas that they had about the world. The Gutenberg Press essentially does the same thing, but now instead of writing on a clay tablet or on a papyrus, you're writing on paper, and you can do it quickly. So now you can disseminate information that much more quickly, that much more effectively, and people now, of course, wish to be heard. So you have this incredible new device, the Gutenberg Press in 1440, that allows individuals to not only create ideas, produce those ideas, and distribute those ideas for others to read. So essentially, all of these scientific inventions really impact the world as we know it in significant, incredibly significant ways. With the compass and firearms, we now have the beginnings of colonialism and imperialism and movements away from these world centers, these cultural centers, and then the press allowing for the dissemination of these radically new ideas. Now, radical in the sense that we're discussing the human individual for the first time. That's the part that makes it very radical. Now, not to say that in doing this, those thinkers abandoned that ancient world. No, Petrarch, for example, right, lived 1304, 1374, so 70 years, was just such a poet and scholar. And he traveled around Europe collecting these manuscripts. And remember, we talked last week about how Aristotle, and especially Aristotle's work, had been translated into Arabic. And with all the movement back and forth between these various cultures, from the Middle East, from North Africa, from the southern part of Europe, and of course this is exactly where we are because Florence is in Italy and Italy's in the Mediterranean. There's a lot of interaction, right? Sort of intercultural movement, and this is where these new texts, which in fact are old, right, are rediscovered. So Aristotle's work, Cicero's work, the Roman writers, the Greek writers are all kind of rediscovered again. And in the case of Petrarch, he is the individual considered to have brought Cicero back from the brink of historical extinction. Because remember, during that 1,000-year reign, right, where it was the Dark Ages in every sense of the word, there was nothing that was new that was written about that was not sort of directly a positive reflection of the church. If there was anything radical or subversive, it was gone. It was destroyed. And whatever copies there were never to be seen or heard from again. But Petrarch comes along in the 1300s and makes it his life's work to collect these manuscripts, collect these stories, and finds the work of Cicero and other Roman writers, and writes extensively on this, this classical antiquity. Now remember, through these rose-tinted glasses, because the writers of that time presented themselves in the best possible light. They wouldn't spend their time talking about their foibles and their misgivings and so on. They would present themselves in the best way possible, which that in itself, coupled with this human aspiration, really is kind of, I don't want to call it a perfect storm, but a perfect combination of this renewed interest in humanity. And so humanism, right, becomes inseparable from the humanities. We even talk today in school and the academic world of the humanities, right, the social sciences, cultural studies, anthropology, psychology, all of these sort of humanities have to do with human beings in society, human beings in trouble, human beings, to be discovered in pre-literate cultures, whatever it may be. But all of these studies focus on the human condition. And the human condition is that new subject that is specific to the Renaissance and also to the Baroque period. So this is what is new. The human condition, if it was discussed by the church, would be something like, well, we know it's really tough now and you're just a poor serf or peasant, but hey, in the next life, you will be so happy. You will be with God forever in heaven. But for right now, don't think about it. Well, they are thinking about it at this point. They are seriously considering the human condition as being less than perfect. So we have individuals looking at themselves and their surroundings for the first time. And so that church patronage, right, and what that means is the church would pay, right, for these scholars to do their work, certainly was extensive, and humanist studies at this early point was still about biblical texts for the most part. But eventually, imagine you have the wherewithal to think, there's some degree of freedom, very small, but it's there, right? Or at least that crack now can be seen. So early humanist scholars did write about biblical texts, right? That's for sure. But eventually, given the Gutenberg Press, given the freedom to think, the freedom to consider in all its dimensions the human condition, of course things are going to come into conflict. They just simply have to, because what is being presented to us by the church seems to be a kind of disconnect with the way that people are actually living. And so this is what ends up happening. There is there was a kind of conflict between humanism, the way that we now look at it in hindsight, and the sort of religious version of it. Because we've got Renaissance humanists, starting with the ancient Greeks, Roman philosophers. Some of them were pagan, right? They were believing in polytheistic worlds, polytheistic gods. So over time, there was a conflict, right? A very historical conflict between the humanism, which is philosophy based strictly on the human condition, and the religious version of it. So we have the study originally of Roman philosophers and historians and poets and so on. And these individuals, most of the time were secular. Because remember, Cicero and we've got the Lucretius and other Romans are writing at a time when Christianity is not in its full bloom that we know it as today. So some of them are secular. Some of them are simply irreligious because it's not an important issue at this point. There are gods for everybody and for everything. So it's not part of the cultural fabric that is discussed in any real sort of real significant way. But needless to say, there is a conflict between these two forms of thinking. And the reason why is because the Renaissance is characterized by a humanist form of thinking that is focusing on the individual, not on institutions, not on cultural products, but on the individual, on just living on a daily basis, the human condition. Not only that, but on creative genius. So you could imagine creative genius could be something very dangerous because some individuals, through the acquisition of scientific devices or the ability to think freely, eventually will come up with ideas that contradict or come into open conflict with established dogma. And that established dogma was the dogma that was brought down from the church. The church was all. They controlled everything. And so if you were talking about things that they being the church disagreed with, that was extremely dangerous. There was freedom to think, but certainly there were repercussions that were sometimes fatal. So those humanists that were thinking and writing at this particular time, acutely self-conscious of the situation that they found themselves in. On the one hand, there's this flowering of human thought, human creativity, whether it's arts, music, literature, whatever, architecture. But at the same time, there is that rigid dogma that is hanging over their heads. And the end result is that some thinkers end up losing their lives. They lose their lives over it. Giordano Bruno, for example, even though he was affiliated with the church as a Dominican friar, right, was actually burnt alive by the Inquisition in a public square in Rome in 1600 for believing that the remote possibility that there might be life on other planets. And not only that, but to talk about the possibility of multiple gods, right? That's pantheism. That's a notion of gods living, amongst us, not far away, like a singular God, sort of over the hill and far away, but gods in the plural living amongst us. That's kind of, what is that? That's ancient Greek thought, right? Polytheistic gods, pantheistic gods, gods that are around everywhere. And this kind of thinking it's heresy, right? It's blasphemous. And sure, whether you think of that today, the difference is that at that time, the church could do something about it. They could punish these people and put them to death. Now, having said that, there is a statue of something like 17 or 20 foot tall statue of Giordano Bruno that is there today in the exact spot where he was burnt alive, burnt to death by the Inquisition. No statues of members of the Inquisition, though, is there? But there is one of Bruno, just as a reminder that free expression and free thought was hard fought and hard gained. This is not something that was granted to us the moment we started thinking out loud. So never forget that. In the search for reality, just consider those that have been killed as a result and murdered by the state, in this case the church, for thinking in this particular way. Now, we don't want to go completely off topic and get really pessimistic, but certainly there were very interesting approaches to these classical texts. And one of the things that comes up is this kind of early form of skepticism. Now, we talked about the skeptics sort of in the post city-state, or the collapse of the city-state around 300 BC. So for about 100 years, we have a variety of different thinkers, one of whom, or one group, are somewhat skeptical. But they're skeptical to the point where they don't want to make any kind of decision. They're basically just, they freeze. Well, we don't know for sure, so let's not even think about it. We have a different kind of effect that's going on here with Renaissance science. What it is instead of skepticism is a healthy suspicion of appeals to authority and pure reason. And the notion is that if we look at something, just because it's old doesn't necessarily mean it's true or correct, right? There's nothing wrong with revisiting these ideas and trying to reimagine them in a different way. So one of the responses, one of the results of revisiting these ancient texts is this suspicion of appeal to authority, because essentially these texts are authoritative, and also the notion of pure reason. Now, this is an idea that, although we're talking about the 1400s, Immanuel Kant will revisit this idea in the late 1700s when he says essentially the same thing in Critique of Pure Reason. There's the title, right? Critique of Pure Reason by Kant essentially states the same thing, that pure reason unaided by the senses is not sufficient to gain knowledge. Pure reason can trick us sometimes in allowing us to think about just ideas and kind of flatten out and work out all the contradictions in this idea without ever having it exist in the real world. So even as far back as the 13 and 1400s, philosophers were thinking this way. A suspicion of appealing to authority, and also a suspicion of pure reason. Now, the solution, because we're talking about science, the solution is that science believes in the return to empirical thinking. Empirical thinking based on studies of the real world, of the material world. So this is one of the solutions to this appeal to authority and this fear of relying strictly on pure reason. So there's a resurgence of empirical thinking and experimenting. And as Galileo says, measure what can be measured and make measurable what cannot be measured. So this notion that Renaissance science is very important is in fact correct, because it is one of the first times where we start seeing the idea of science moving and merging with philosophy. In this search for reality, science is now going to give us the tools to allow us to understand what exactly we are seeing with our eyes, with our senses, and how to understand it. So to conclude, the importance of science at this point is that we now have a combination of empiricism and rationalism. Now, I think the first set of PowerPoint slides in the first lecture that I presented to you, I made clear these two main positions, right? Empiricism, basing a viewpoint on the material world, on materialism, and compare that with rationalism, which is thoughts about the world. In this point now, this is rationalism leading to idealism. But here, for the first time, the two of them are combined in earnest. The best of both, right? The notion of rationalism is not something that empiricists throw out completely. But what science does is it uses both of them. It turns around and combines empirical sense data, observations, with rationalism. And so what happens is we have thinkers that are able to use both of these. And Galileo, for example, talks about how any discussion of nature has to be written, as he says, in the language of mathematics. And what that means is whatever observations individuals have about reality and the natural world need to be structured, right? And mathematics is one of many. I mean, geometry, for example, something Plato was enamored with, Pythagoras as well. Galileo's saying kind of the same thing, that we need to understand the language that nature speaks. We need to be able to hear it and understand it. And the language that it was believed to speak was the language of mathematics. And so if that's the case, you observe first, and only after do you start modeling it mathematically. So modeling mathematically, it sounds a bit odd, but it's basically taking kind of a mechanical or mechanistic view of the world, that there are causes and effects, there are relationships between things. And this is essentially what is considered mathematical. So these models, these sort of natural laws, begin in earnest at this point. The pre-Socratics sort of set the stage. And of course, we're talking 400 BC. So let's say definitely 1,000 years later, right? So no, in fact, even longer, but 1,400 years later, because we're in the 13th century. So we're looking at modeling, which is based on very sort of, not infantile, but sort of very early observations of the natural world. And so what happens at this particular time is we have Galileo, we have Newton, who are now sort of looking at the external world, the material world, at reality, and looking for these natural laws, and believe that these natural laws are predictable, right? That we can identify them, and we can identify them with the same precision as mathematics. This is the relationship between mathematics and natural laws, that they are predictable, both are predictable, and both are rigid, but both can be measured, right? This is what becomes important. So it leads to a real sense of optimism that science really has got the whole world to discover. And it's true. I mean, that is essentially what is about to happen. And so the world is looked at in terms of expressing these certain laws that appeal to the scientist, but also is going to justify why things look the way they do. So a mathematical model that is constructed using predictable, rigid natural laws allows for some degree of consistency when we look at the natural world. And so the uniformity, right, of these physical laws are assumed to hold and assumed to be consistent because they are uniform. But what ends up happening is that the Earth all of a sudden is no longer sort of that special place. Remember, the church believed that the sun revolved around the Earth, and they did right up until Galileo. And even after Galileo was convicted of heresy and was basically under house arrest for essentially the rest of his life, the church, within about 15 years of Galileo's life, while he was still alive, right, and they kind of quietly took that out of the books. They quietly took that out of their scientific dogma. So the notion that the Earth did not occupy this special place, in other words, the center of the universe, it was the sun instead. And of course, the ironic thing is ancient religions did put the sun as the creator, right? It was a religion based on natural science. The sun gives life, right? Think about it. The sun gives life. Why not build a religion around that? Well, the Egyptians did. So just an aside. But the point is here, by the 13 and 1400s, science is now indicating very clearly that the Earth no longer has that special place in creation, right? It is not the center of the universe. We rotate around the sun just like other planets. And does that destroy theology? Well, what it does is it questions it. It questions the dogma. Now, Newton, as an example, was still someone who had a strong religious faith, so did not want to turn around and sort of actively destroy theology. That was not his claim to fame, was not his desire. But because he was religious, he looked at these laws of physics as evidence of a perfect creator. Very much an idea that St. Alcim had. We can think of a necessary God. We can think of Augustine thinking along the same lines, that there has to be a creator behind the beauty of nature. So not everything is thrown out. Science sometimes, depending on who the scientist is, tries to go back and sort of reformulate these ideas which had been dogma for hundreds of years by the church, to try to find some way to justify that dogma in the first place. And Newton, for example, was an individual who, yes, was a Christian, was religious, and looked to reality as expressions of his religious belief, right? He believed that these laws were created and maintained consistently by this perfect creator. So it was a way to kind of reconcile both. So one of the other issues that, as you can imagine, when science is revisiting ancient texts, questioning authority, questioning pure reason, eventually individuals would start to question the relationship that they had with religion as well, because this had been literally, and I cannot express this anymore, quite literally the glue that held together their lives. Religion was such a strong component in their everyday life that over time, even it was up on the table for discussion. It was on the table for discussion in terms of, hey, we have this humanistic view of the world. How does this fit in with religion? How far do we question authority? Because if authority is religious and theological, do we want to destroy that, right? We need to be really careful. So Gardner, in his book, says that yes, intellectual, cultural, technological shifts do sort of set the foundation for the Reformation, which is Protestantism, and the key word here is protest. And what Protestantism does, if you're a Protestant, is you now begin to think about your individual relationship to God, not one that is done through the church, as if the church is kind of an intermediary. You can pray directly to God. And again, we're not saying that everything gets destroyed here and theology is gone. Theology is questioned. It is questioned. It is reformulated. It is in certain cases strengthened. If you're looking at Descartes or Newton, and other times if it's Giordano Bruno, you're saying, hey, what about this, right? I'm not out to destroy religion, but you need to consider the following. So what happens here with the Protestant Reformation and how it fits into this overall scheme of Renaissance is the idea that we now think and we consider that human relationship to God, the individual's relationship to God, rather than the relationship we have to the church, and the church in turn is a representation of God on earth. So that focus on Scripture is now something that can be done by many more people. You can actually have a Bible in your house. You can go through passages. You can read and reread them. You can study them, because a printing press is now making these kinds of books available. Because remember, up until then, the individuals that were there, that were living in those societies, were either poorly educated, if they had any education at all. Many of them could barely read or write. Many of these texts were written in Latin, so individuals may not have been able to even read Latin. But the printing press allows translations or sort of a vernacular version, the King James Bible, for example, vernacular versions of the Bible to be put in the hands of the quote-unquote average person, right? The average serf or peasant. And individuals like Luther, for example, translated the Bible into German, for example. And so we've got critical editions. We now have editions that look at earlier Greek sources. The work that's done on the Bible to fill in certain gaps, certain ideas that may not fit correctly or fit well. Now work is earnestly underway to fill in those gaps, to make the Bible more comprehensive, to not have it sort of based so much on faith, but a desire to base it on as much factual information as possible. So all of this is done by having the Gutenberg Press print these Bibles for the average person to be able to read. So again, very, very remarkable. Now, one of the subcategories of the Renaissance period is the Baroque era. And again, when we think of Baroque, we tend to think about music because it seems to be what has remained and what has endured the longest. The Baroque era, we can think of Johann Sebastian Bach, right? Bach wrote during the Baroque era. Not so much about architecture, but dance and sculpture. There were many, many Baroque painters. Their work is still there. But the Baroque era is slightly different here from the straight-up Renaissance because it has its peculiarities, which we're going to look at in just a moment. But the Baroque era does lead it's during the late Renaissance period, it does allow this transition towards 18th century Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment of the 1700s. So it is important. And so we think about this era sort of when we talk about philosophy is the early modern period, right? The early modern era with Rene Descartes. We're going to look at Thomas Hobbes, Pascal, Baruch Spinoza. These are thinkers that are part of this, it's going like almost 200 years, but it's during again, incredibly rich period where writers, philosophers, and thinkers are, as we say, pushing the envelope in all kinds of ways. And of course, some individuals pay maybe not for their studies with their life, but some are exiled or some are always, being chased by the church. Descartes spent most of his adult life being chased by the church, or always slightly one step ahead. Even though he is able to prove the existence of God, or tries to with his theories, he also knew that he could get in trouble with not the law, but the law in this case being the church. Spinoza, again, although he was Jewish, he still was ousted and was exiled from his own Jewish community for questioning the relationship of God to nature. So these individuals pay for their original thoughts in a variety of ways. Thankfully, at this point, no one else has been murdered by the church, because in the Baroque era towards Enlightenment, the church, the grip that the church has over culture, we'll say in political formations, doesn't begin to loosen intentionally. It begins to get pushed back upon, and that grip begins to loosen because more individuals are thinking in original ways. So it isn't that the church chooses to loosen their grip. They have to, right? The grip begins to crumble. So Gardner also talks about others such as Locke, John Locke, David Hume, George Berkeley, Immanuel Kant. So early modern period, it's about 300 years. And it is early, it is modern, but there is a clear indication, a clear, form of new types of thought that are coming out of this. Now, to get back to the Baroque context here and the Baroque era, there is still a level of self-reflection which begins during the Renaissance, but it's allegedly becomes more pessimistic. And it gets pessimistic because we talk about, the new individual, and this new individual thinking about life and the finality of life, the fact that we only have one chance here, the fact that our life could end at any point. Because remember, life is not easy at this point. I think the average age for an adult may have been something like 45 years of age. And you think even of someone like Plato, who lived to his 70s, didn't work every day, didn't work at all actually, because he was an aristocrat. But the average person, right, the finality of life, the fact that you're staring death in the face almost every day. And remember too, public executions are occurring all the time here in public. That's the key word here. And some of them are just horrible to watch. And this is a reminder that, the church has power. So you're reminded of the finality of your life every single day. So now suddenly you become self-aware, self-reflexive upon the lack of human potential, the lack of human creativity. Even if you're an artist, quite often you're an artist that was commissioned by the church to do certain works of art. So you can't turn around and start painting soup cans like Andy Warhol. No, you have to you have to create works of art that reflect, the glory of God, reflect the beauty of nature, reflect the wonderfulness of everything, when in fact it wasn't exactly that case. There were many things during the Baroque era that really pushed upon people's sense of finality. And most of it was war, right? The 30 Years' War. There's also inequality between, poor peasants and serfs and very rich landowners and manors, lords and dukes and duchesses, and the whole middle management between kings and serfs. There's an increase in that. There is also the beginnings of colonialism and imperialism, the introduction of new ways of thinking, new ways of living. Colonialism, of course, and imperialism is conquest, right? It's oppressing it's a new part of the world that your country seems to have discovered. So there is a sense of pessimism in all of this wonderful creative flourishing of scientific and cultural and artistic endeavors. And what do we get? A 30-year-long war. We get inequality. We get the finality of death every day. Colonialism, imperialism. It's kind of a downer, right? It's kind of depressing. But this is the way people are thinking during the Baroque world. And these sort of pessimistic currents are clearly there. So the result, of course, every time there is a situation, there is maybe pushback, or there is at least a way to reconcile the issue, in this case, a sense of pessimism, to reconcile that. And thinkers at this point decide, okay, we have got these two ways of looking at the world, which has not gone away anytime soon. And those two ways of thinking are the materialistic way and the idealistic way. Now, empiricism, empirical thinking, material world, matter, they're all on the one side. Rational or idealistic, that is on the other side. Now, idealistic, we're talking about thinking of just the world as spirit, the world as just ideas, or the world as will and an idea. That's really what we're talking about here. So we have materialists who are looking at the world. Again, this is a combination, right? A combination of these two sort of tendencies, because they're not absolutely hard in the sense that, they're rigidly one or the other. Science combines both of them. And one of the ways in which they're able to combine it is to get the best of both. They're able, on the one hand, to look at the world and say, okay, the material world comes to us, to our senses, in the following way. But because we are metaphysical creatures, right, we're always stepping into the beyond, such as the picture here, right? This gentleman stepping into the beyond. What happens with us is we're always looking beyond to try to understand the world. So at this point, because science is now such a pervasive form of thinking and a pervasive form of understanding the world, scientists begin to look at the world as being mechanical in nature. Now, not that it has gears and cogs and wheels and things, but mechanical in the sense that it can be calculated. Sometimes it is even conscious. There are clear causal effects, clear causal relationships in this universe that, yes, may be complex, but it is still mechanical. And along comes Descartes as one of the very first individuals, the very first philosophers, who is somewhat of a scientist. He's a physician, but is also a philosopher. And he comes up with this idea that if we have this materialistic and idealistic view of the world, then perhaps there is in the world material substances and spiritual substances, which is quite remarkable, because we have here for the first time the ability to look at the world in a way that helps us to define it in terms of substances. So let's take a look here at Descartes, and we'll wrap up the last sort of dozen or so slides by looking at Rene Descartes and exactly what it was that he was talking about. Now, Descartes is considered to have sort of begun modern philosophy, and modern philosophy breaks with medieval thought. Now, medieval thought is what we looked at last week, which would be Thomas Aquinas, St. Altham, theological thinking. And he tries to make a break with this kind of medieval way of thinking. Not that it's old-fashioned, but because of science, science is discovering new things that theology can't answer. And this is the same dilemma that the ancient Athenians, the pre-Socratics, and of course Plato and Aristotle, they too were discovering things about the world that could not be answered in mythology. The notion of society, the notion of democracy, for example, democracy, such a fundamental idea to ancient Athens. There's no reference in mythology. It's this brand new thing that they've created. So consider those two moments in historical time, right, philosophical time, or the history of consciousness, as being very similar. So Descartes comes along and wishes to make this decisive break with the medieval tradition of philosophy. And of course, it makes sense, because for the last, if he was born in 1596, he's actually at the very tail end of the Renaissance period. And he is also, because he's considered the first modern philosopher, is that first step towards Enlightenment thinking. So he is trying to be an enlightened philosopher, but remember, he's very well aware that the church is not far behind because he's writing in France, and France, the French church, the French Catholic Church had a stranglehold, literally a stranglehold on cultural production, artistic production, any form of creativity, culture, early forms of society, to a much later period of time than, say, the rest of Western Europe, for a whole range of reasons we're not going to get into, but it was. So Descartes is writing under those conditions. He's not living in England where there is religious tolerance, because after the English Civil War, there had to be religious tolerance, because otherwise the country would have ripped itself apart again. Descartes isn't so lucky. He's living in France where that hasn't happened yet, but the church is still very powerful. Now, he doesn't want to contradict the church, but what he wants to do is widen that doctrine, right? Open that doctrine up. And in the same way as we see the medieval thinkers open up theology to make room for reason, which is a philosophical tool, Descartes is doing the same thing with theology here by opening it up and making room for science and scientific evidence and scientific information. So he is trying to do that. Now, he's done other things, but let's at least focus on his philosophy because there's lots there. Okay, so here is the way in which Descartes believed that we could set up some kind of foundational knowledge. And he called it methodological skepticism. So he's a skeptic, but he doesn't stop dead in his tracks. He uses skepticism in order to achieve his ends. And here's how he does it. So he says, look, if you can start from a firm foundation and move out from there, the likelihood is you can now assert truths that are consistent, that are certain. Now compare that with empiricism, where we are looking at the notion of, well, we have this much information, science has taken us this far, we have tentative conclusions, but we're not 100% sure, right? That's completely normal. But Descartes wants to have firm truths, firm foundations. So what does he do? He asks himself, okay, can I doubt something? And yeah, you can doubt virtually everything. You can doubt what you're seeing outside this window right here. Doesn't exist, right? Reality doesn't exist. So he says, okay, look, in order for us to achieve and arrive at a firm foundation of truth, we need to discard everything that can be doubted, which is in fact literally everything. But if we can do this, if at one point we can stop, we end up with an idea that is essentially doubt-proof. But we need to keep digging away and say, no, can this be untrue? Can this be untrue? And sure enough, that's exactly what's happening. So Descartes starts with sense perception. Okay? In other words, empiricism, and attacks empiricism because he says, look, there are things that I can think about physically that may be incorrect. When you think about, for example, if you've ever met anyone that has had an amputation, they talk about what's called a phantom limb, right? If they close their eyes, they can almost feel that missing limb is still there. So sense perception is maybe not the way to go because there is some level of doubt. But Descartes just keeps clawing away and sort of pulling back everything that can be doubted until finally the only thing that he knows for sure is, I think, therefore I am, right? And this is a purely rational position because it doesn't depend on sense data. Remember, sense data can trick us. So in his eyes, this is self-evidently true, right? We use reason to move ourselves towards it. And we say, look, even if we're being deceived about something, right? Something, me, my mind, my spiritual part of me, it's what is experiencing the deception. So if you want to find that firm foundation, for Descartes, it is, I think, therefore I am. If I start with that, I can now build from something very specific, or in fact, from something very general down to something very specific. That's called deductive reasoning. And this is something that is associated with Cartesian thinking. So he says, look, what is self-evident is that I exist. because I am a thinking being, no matter what. Where I doubt the most is up here. My mind continues to function, therefore I continue to exist. My mind exists, but the important thing is my mind, which is the process by which I use reason and rationality, that continues to exist. That is consistent. That is firm, because if I can doubt something, it is my mind that is doing the doubting, not my senses. Right? That's essentially what he's saying. If you close your eyes and touch something, you can imagine, okay, what is this? And you start kind of guessing what it might be. Here, when you're using the mind, because it exists, it continues to exist even as it doubts. I think, therefore I am. And that's what he means. Now, one of the conclusions that Descartes has with this is that he says that mind and body are actually distinct, right? They're two separate things. So I can doubt my body, right, and what I feel with my senses, but not my mind. Because even if I'm doubting, my mind continues to function. And so as well, if my mind is the way in which I can doubt something, that is for sure. That is absolutely essential. So mind and body are not identical, right? They must be made of different substances, right? Of different stuff. So Descartes believes, and this is where it gets a bit weird, Descartes believes that we are fundamentally mind, not body. Now, he doesn't mean that physically, like we don't exist and we simply are minds floating in a jar. No. What he does say is that what we can be more certain of is our minds. Now, he goes further. He says, okay, I know that I am a mind, that is for sure, that cannot be doubted, because the act of doubting still involves my mind functioning. I think, therefore I am. So if that is the case, one idea my mind can entertain is that there is the possibility of a perfect being. So there's that firm foundation. You scrape away everything that can be doubted, especially sense perception. You focus on this one idea for sure, which is that my mind continues to function. I think, therefore I am, therefore I exist. But notice the way it's written. I think comes first, right? If I'm thinking, then I must exist. But it's the mind that sets the precedent. So the idea of one mind, or my mind, can entertain this notion of a perfect being, if you're trying to prove the existence of God, is the ontological argument that we looked at from last week, right? I exist, therefore God may exist as well, because I can conjure up this perfect being. So this is how Descartes is able to reconcile theology and science. And so he says, okay, look, if I'm looking to not be deceived, I've established my existence. Remember, I think, therefore I am, ergito cogito sum, right? If I've established that I exist because my mind exists, and I can establish the existence of a perfect being, why not? Because a being that is perfect wouldn't try to deceive me, wouldn't try to make me doubt. So our perceptions there ultimately correspond with reality. We see in the world that we see through our senses, we see reflected back the existence of this perfect being. And so this is how Descartes is able to reconcile these two ideas. Strip away all the doubt, start with a firm foundation. My mind exists. My mind is able to conjure up a perfect being. Therefore, that perfect being actually exists. Now, into that, I would just like to read a very short passage from this book here, which is by Etienne Gilson, The Unity of Philosophical Experience. And he mentions here a philosopher named William of Ockham. And William of Ockham says that, first of all, that one should not account for the existence of an empirically given thing by imagining behind and beyond it another thing whose hypothetical existence cannot be verified. So, as much as Descartes tried, it's not perfect. You have to eventually make some leap of faith to go, yeah, okay. And it is somewhat ironic that the first thing that Descartes wanted to prove with this firm foundation is the existence of God. So, if you look back and if you are sort of not super critical, but wonder why the argument is structured the way it is, you could look at it one of two ways. Either Descartes was still very afraid of the church and wanted to present this scientific formula and use it only to prove the existence of God, or he realized that over time, if the world becomes more secular and religion moves off to the side rather than this central position of power, then we could look at Descartes' scientific discovery, we could say, or at least philosophical discovery of deductive reasoning and go, yeah, I see how it works. We don't have to look, for example, to prove the existence of God. We can use it to do other things. So take it with however you wish, but certainly the notion that for Descartes, if I can imagine a perfect being, why would I think that perfect being is trying to deceive me into making me think that it doesn't exist? So this really is what Descartes is trying to show to us. Not only that with this firm foundation of the thinking mind, that we can conjure up a perfect being, but more important is this notion that the world is actually made up of two different substances, right? Mind or spirit and body or matter. And we are the only individuals, because for Descartes, animals don't have this, that we have these two. We're not just body, we are also mind. And so the trick here is, okay, remember, he's saying these are two utterly separate substances. But he argues at the same time that our mind directs our body with free will. So this mechanical view of the world, this notion of free will, can still operate because we can look at the world from this mechanistic point of view by saying that, yes, the mind acts upon the body. Now, how it acts upon the body is kind of tricky because not long after, Spinoza in this book says a rather interesting passage when he says, if things have nothing in common with each other, one cannot be the cause of the other. So again, although Descartes presents a certain idea, there are critics along the way that rethink what Descartes is saying and try to take it further. And if not, at least to criticize it, to say, no, we need to move in a completely new way. So this is what Descartes is unable to do. He's unable to reconcile this notion that mind and body are made of two utterly different substances, yet mind can still somehow direct our body using free will. And this mechanistic view of the world that somehow mind controls and is able to allow the body to do these things doesn't quite come out as crystal clear, right? Because again, the mind is fundamentally different. He says it, right? All matter occupies space. Mind does not. Matter is divisible. Mind is not. Mind is a thinking substance. Matter is not. And he is very clear on how these two substances are utterly different. And so we have this sort of dualistic view of the world, for sure, but we don't have a solution as to how they interact. We don't know, because really Descartes stresses repeatedly that they are very, very different. Now, when we talk about these two different substances, really all Descartes is talking about is just a basic entity. And we have a material substance, which is our body, and we have a mental substance, which is spirit, right, which is our minds. But again, it's that interaction that we are not quite sure how this works, because again, just to go back to Spinoza, who writes shortly after, we'll look at him next week. Even Spinoza, when he talks about definitions, when he talks of substance, he says that which is in itself and is conceived through itself, i.e., no concept of any other thing is needed for forming a concept of it. So Spinoza kind of takes Descartes almost to his logical conclusion. He says, okay, those substances, when it comes to spirit, are utterly unconditioned, utterly unconnected with that mental substance. So here we are, the same problem. How do they interact? How does the mind allow me to move my hand up and down, or to get out of this chair, or to know that behind me there is something that I should walk into, i.e. a wall, but I don't have to turn around and look at it, right? My senses aren't necessary. So this is an issue that really plagued Cartesian thought and Cartesian dualism in particular. The fact that the mind operates independently of the body, right, in its own realm. And if whether you look at Descartes or Spinoza even says, if these things are utterly different, then they should not even be able to interact with one another. And that's kind of where we're at in terms of the interaction. So it is a serious issue, a serious problem, because Descartes ultimately isn't able to answer that question. So he struggles and tries to come up with various solutions. And there are some, we'll call them far-fetched. I consider the occasionalist position somewhat far-fetched, and this is one that's from the Stanford entry on Descartes. And it runs something like this, right? Some of Descartes' followers adopted an occasionalist position, according to which God mediates the causal relations between mind and body. Mind does not affect body, and body does not affect mind. So that would be Spinoza's position. But God gives the mind appropriate sensations at the right moment, right, on occasion. And that makes the body move by putting it into the correct brain at that moment, so that it corresponds to the volition to pick up a pencil. Other philosophers adopted yet other solutions, the monism of Spinoza, which I just referred to, or the pre-established harmony of Leibniz. And again, now you're stuck with, remember, William of Ockham, right, to remind us once again that we cannot account for the existence of an empirically given thing by imagining behind or beyond it another thing whose hypothetical existence cannot be verified. So the jury is out, right? Clearly, incredible things were happening during the Renaissance and the Baroque era to move science and philosophy forward. But those movements really came with certain issues that needed to be corrected. And the history of philosophy is these corrections, right? Revisiting these ideas to see if there's some other way we can explain it. And certainly the way in which two utterly different substances, mind or spirit and body, interact is never made completely clear by Descartes. And even he ultimately admits, no, I don't have the solution. So it is a way to present an idea and the hope that others coming along later might be able to prove these conclusions or these solutions as in fact valid. But that's the history of philosophy.